The region is holding its collective breath, hoping cooler heads will prevail and that escalating rhetoric will not lead to open conflict. Earlier this week, Iran warned Qatar and Saudi Arabia that if it is attacked, it will retaliate by striking American targets in those countries. And to explain what's at stake for the region, I'm joined on Euronews by Qiήσεις Kamráva, a leading expert on Middle Eastern politics. Professor, can you explain the mechanics of what's driving the current standoff?
If the Americans were to attack targets inside Iran, then politically the Iranian government simply cannot afford not to react. It cannot bear the political costs domestically of looking as if it is incapable of hitting back. And therefore, it will have to retaliate in one form or another. This is precisely what we saw in 2020 when the Americans assassinated General Soleimani. And this is what we saw in June of 2025 when the Israelis and the Americans attacked Iran and the United States attacked Iranian nuclear facilities. And so in both of those instances, we saw Iranian retaliation. And there's no reason to believe that this time would be any different. If anything, the Iranians this time would want to certainly show that they can throw a much more lethal punch.
And could you explain how any miscalculation now could have serious consequences well beyond Iran and the United States, especially for countries hosting American forces?
Well, in circumstances like this, rhetoric tends to take a life of its own, and it becomes extremely difficult for political actors to dial it down. But I think a sober assessment of the consequences of the day after is what is needed. And so long as those voices of reason appear, and they have the day, they can carry the day, then I think what we're likely to see is kind of a dialing down of tensions. I think it's important to keep a couple of things in mind, if I may just elaborate. A few days ago, everybody thought that the Iranian government was on the verge of collapse, that the Islamic Republic was a spent force, and it was only a matter of days before it tips over. And now what we see is that once again, we were too hasty in writing the obituary of the Islamic Republic.
And turning to the situation inside Iran itself, what's your assessment of what's happening on the ground right now amid widespread protests and a heavy security response?
By all accounts, what we hear is that pro-government protesters now by far outnumber anti-government protesters. Now, I think it's important to remember that in order to be more secure, anti-government protesters come out under the cover of night. And so it's in the evenings, and with the shutdown of the internet, it is extremely difficult for us to accurately assess how widespread those protests are. Regardless of the size of the protests, what we see is that anti-government sentiments, anger, popular anger, is extremely widespread across the country.
For now, Gulf states are watching closely and urging restraint from both Washington and Tehran. Adil Halim, Euronews, Doha.